From the Jaws of a Wolf by an unknown author. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. From the Jaws of a Wolf, a tale of a dog's bravery. "You have a noble-looking dog there, Mr. Knowles," I remarked to the master of a Wisconsin farmhouse where I had stopped for the night, as I noticed an enormous mastiff that was stretched at full length along the floor. My hostess's 2-year-old baby was playing with the animal's ears, while the other children were jumping and tumbling about over the body. "Yes," answered Mr. Knowles, "and he is as noble as he looks. He has justified his claim to all the kindnesses we can bestow on him. Part of his history is sad enough, poor fellow. I suppose you have had him for some time?" "No," he replied, "only since last winter. The story of his life before then is a complete blank, so far as we are concerned." "What?" I asked in astonishment. "Do you mean to say that such a splendid animal as this is a stray dog? What a pity it is that you can't talk and tell us where you are from, old fellow," I continued, patting the huge head. Thereupon Lion solemnly hit the floor 1 or 2 sounding thumps with his tail, and then stood up and pushed his nose into my lap. "He is quick to recognize his friends," said Mr. Knowles, "and has already included you among them. He is very affectionate and will allow our youngsters to do what they like with him. But let him who rouses Lion's anger beware, for he is then a lion indeed." "I conclude from what you say, then, that you have seen him thus tested?" I asked. "Yes," replied Mr. Knowles with emphasis, "I have indeed, and it was at a moment when my own life depended upon his strength and courage." "Please tell me how it happened," I begged. "I'm sure the story must be most interesting." "All right," said Mr. Knowles as he settled himself for the narrative while I listened eagerly for what was to come. "Until last winter," said he, "I, like most others hereabouts, cared very little for our western wolves. I had never seen any large ones, and I was convinced that a big Newfoundland dog, such as I then possessed, was a match for the fiercest of them. One cold winter morning I had to go to the village of L , 3 miles away from here. I was obliged to walk, as heavy snowdrifts in the way prevented me from riding. I was not alone, however, for my dog accompanied me. He was, as I told you, a Newfoundland, a big fellow and full of pluck. We had done about 2/3 of this distance when I noticed a movement in some bushes nearby, and in a moment the head and shoulders of a great wolf appeared among them. I saw at once that he was far above the average size, but I did not mind him, since, besides my dog, I had my double-barreled gun with me. I'm a bad shot, it's true, but having the gun reassured me. Poor Tige, my dog, made straight for the wolf, and they clinched at the edge of the thicket. Such a fight as that I hope I never may see again. I knew that Tige would never give in while he lived, but as the furious animals rolled over and over each other, I soon perceived that he was getting the worst of it. You can imagine my feelings at that moment. I ran toward them at once with my gun leveled, but they kept on changing their position so quickly that I was afraid to fire for fear of injuring Tige. At last I fired, but my shot seemed to have missed. In any case, however, I should have been too late to save my dog's life. In an instant the wolf left his dying victim and rushed upon me. I discharged my other barrel, but it had no effect. As he approached, I could see his eyes gleaming like coals of fire, and the open mouth disclosing the grim rows of teeth. He was very long and gaunt, while his bristling hairs and the blood with which he was covered added to the ferociousness of his appearance. At such a moment one's brain acts quickly. Short as was the time occupied by the wolf's advance, I recognized at once the hopelessness of my position and the horror of my impending fate. Then my thoughts flew back to home, and I wondered how my wife and children would get on without me. But I was determined to die fighting, at any rate. Just as my foe was upon me, I sprang aside, and grasping my gun by the barrels, struck at him with all the strength of despair. Where I hit him, I do not know, but the force of the blow was sufficient to break my weapon short off at the breech. The effect of the blow gave me a little breathing time, and when the wolf renewed his attack, I was able to meet him once more with the part of the gun still left in my hand. Again and again I showered down my blows upon him until at last the strong steel barrels actually began to bend. But all my efforts were in vain, and at last, utterly exhausted, I realized that the end could no longer be delayed. Just then something dark flashed past me, and to my surprise and thankfulness I perceived that help had arrived. The biggest dog I had ever seen had fastened upon the wolf, and not all the latter's efforts were able to shake him off. Much as I should have liked to assist my rescuer, in my present condition this was impossible, and I was forced to stand by and await the issue of the terrible combat. Often it seemed as though the wolf would once more prove victorious, but then the great dog would put forth all his strength in a mighty effort that turned the tide in his favor. At length, to my relief, the wolf began to weaken and finally turned to run away. But this the dog would not permit, and the fight began again. Now, however, the dog's success was no longer doubtful, and but a short time sufficed for him to make an end of his grim opponent. Then, and not till then, he turned to me, and grasping my coat, attempted to pull me away. Following in the direction in which he was urging me, after going about half a mile, I came upon the senseless body of a man. The stranger's limbs were badly frozen, and all my efforts to revive him were unavailing. While I was engaged in this task, a neighbor came up and at once hurried off to the village for assistance. In about an hour, everything that medical skill could suggest was being done for the poor man, but he remained unconscious, and that night he died. We found out afterwards that he was an English man without relatives and with no friend but his faithful dog. A sudden attack of illness must have overtaken him and left him in the state in which I found him. I discovered by experiment that the dog answered to the name of Lion, and tried hard to induce him to come with me. For a long time he refused, appearing utterly inconsolable at his master's death. Indeed, he would not leave the body while it remained in sight. But after the funeral, he at last accepted the inevitable and allowed me to take him home. From that day he has been one of the family, and as I see him playing and romping with the children, I often think how little they realize the great debt that they and I owe him. End of From the Jaws of a Wolf.